You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. So, firstly, thank you very much for joining us on the telephone. If you could just introduce yourself and then tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, that would be really good to start us off.
Absolutely. So my name is Robert Grillio, and I'm the founder and director of the nonprofit Free from Harm, which is dedicated to helping end animal exploitation and also make connections between different forms of exploitation. I wrote Farm to Fable, The Fictions of Our Animal-Consuming Culture, the book in 2016. And it's also kind of become a presentation series. So I have a Farm to Fable presentation for the general public, which I've been giving in different places, including recently at the UK Veg Festival this past weekend, as well as a version of the presentation for activists, which is specifically targeted to people who want to use the insights from the Farm to Fable book to help empower their activism.
So did you write the book first, or did you start the presentations first? How did that develop?
Right. So the way it developed was that you have to go back in a bit of a timeline to kind of see how this developed. But in my 20s and 30s, I worked as a creative professional, marketing professional for ad agencies that had food industry clients, large ones like McDonald's and Kraft Foods, and some of the bigger names in the U.S. food industry. And I was working on things like packaging and signage and advertising, and I got to see behind the scenes how brands used certain kinds of fictions to promote animal products. And I didn't realize it at the time. For example, the Happy Meal box, which is ubiquitous and famous throughout, the world probably at this point. It's a package that's marketed to children, right? And so it shows these happy, fun farm animals on the package of a product that contains the body parts of animals that likely lived very miserable, short lives. And so here we have something that's marketed to the most vulnerable audience in society, children, and using very, stark deception about what's happening, about the reality of the lives of those animals and what people are eating. And so, later in life, when I became involved in animal ethics, I looked back on this experience and realized that I really needed to leverage that experience, and so that I could help the general audience, the public at large, better see how we're being manipulated to kind of buy in, believe in these kinds of fictions that our culture perpetuates about consuming animals and the normalization of exploiting them. So from that background, Farm to Fable started out as a presentation because it was very visual, right? There's just like in our everyday lives, we go out and we see street signs and billboards, and we go to the grocery store, we see in-store signage. We go online, we see the same kind of thing. We go into restaurants, we see the Farm to Fork rather, kind of motifs. So wherever we go, these fictions follow us. And I started collecting all of these different examples that I was seeing and then naming them and identifying them because I can see the different patterns. Like this one is about masculinity. This is about if you eat more meat, you're going to be more masculine. Or the opposite. If like dairy and eggs are marketed to a female audience for the most part. If you consume more dairy and eggs, you'll be more feminine. So all of these different kinds of things, seeing and trying to categorize them so that we could put them into neater categories that people could recognize. And I started building the presentation from all of these different examples. And after about 4 years of doing this presentation, a publisher came to me and asked me if I wanted to do a book. And that was in 2016.
So was it a difficult process turning a presentation, which I suppose is you sort of, meeting an audience and talking to them, showing them, turning that into a book that can get that over, or was it actually, easier?
It seemed like, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it definitely seemed like a natural progression from being a visual person, but also having some writing background, from very early on. It seemed like a natural progression from the presentation to the book. And I had been doing a lot of writing on our blog, our freefromharm.org blog, where I've been writing a lot about these fiction. So I had a lot of material to mine from. And so I was able to pull from a lot of existing material, and then it really kind of, forced me to kind of think through more about not only how to identify these fictions and expose why they are fictions and what the facts are, what the reality is behind them, but also to then the more challenging task of, so some people ask, well, now that we know more, or we have a better understanding of these fictions and how they work in society, what do we do about it? How do we, how do we confront them? How do we best challenge them? So that became the focus of the last 40 or so pages of the book, so that I could give more advanced kind of advice, perhaps, or suggestions as far as how do we, as activists, use this better understanding of fictions.
So do you think if you hadn't worked in those industries in your earlier life, you wouldn't really have been aware of this, or is this something you would have had a passion about, anyway?
I think having the background in food advertising and branding gave me kind of an angle, if you will, to come into the discussion about animal rights and veganism, and have kind of a perspective or an angle that I feel, at least, is sorely overlooked. Because what I find is that even those of us that are very heavily involved in the movement to try to help animals, in many other justice movements as well, many of us are not aware of the kinds of fictions that are being kind of like they're influencing them. And so you can tell they're influencing them because they're also using the language of those fictions, right? So, for example, we will say the word meat. We rarely think of what that word really means. We just use the word meat to refer to an object for consumption, but we really don't consider symbolically or metaphorically how heavy a meaning it really is. And I would say that if we don't contextualize using that word, we're just kind of reinforcing this idea that animals are just mere commodities in our society, and that certain animals are, at least. And so I try to qualify that word when I can, or at least ask people to think about what it really means, because to be called a piece of meat is a pretty heavy, assault on someone. It basically means you're an object, you're good for only one thing, or you're just not worth anything. So it's total disempowerment. Sometimes women are called just pieces of meat. We know what that refers to. But to be an animal that has been reduced to just a piece of meat means you're basically worth nothing. Or to say, for example, to use the language of like harvesting an animal rather than slaughtering, the violent killing of an animal. To use the word harvesting suggests that they're just vegetables that we pluck out of the ground and there's no harm at all. or even the word like, domestication. What is domestication? It's a process of thousands of years of forcing once indigenous, free agents, free roaming animals into confinement, and to dominate them, to selectively breed them for thousands of years for certain traits, which make them produce more milk or eggs, or make them even more subservient or more dependent on us, so that they're easier to manage, right? So there's all this kind of language out there that that is part of the fictional, mosaic that we need to be challenging, I think.
So it's about getting people to re-look at something or rethinking about it, because I suppose you just, think of meat, and that's a general term. What your sort of book and talks do is get people to actually, rethink about that and think actually, if you look into it more deeper, there is a lot more to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially with words that just objectify animals, such as meat. That's one of the questions I was asked yesterday. I was on the Clive Bull show, and one of the things he asked me was, well, isn't it a great thing that we're moving towards this, cell-based meat or lab meat or whatever, they want to call it. And I said, yes, but, it's really not enough, because what we're doing is challenging society's preconceived prejudices about certain species of animals. So replacing real flesh products with cell or lab grown is certainly going to spare a lot of suffering. But I fear that if we don't change our views about animals and our relationship with them, fundamentally, we will still find ways of exploiting them and considering them basically here to serve us.
So is it a difficult process getting the message out? Because I suppose obviously there's people that completely agree with you, or are aware of what goes on, and then there's a whole audience that don't, and then there's even another audience who are just going to turn off when they hear you talking about that. So is that the most sort of difficult process, getting that message out?
Yeah, it's always challenging. I think that we have some valuable lessons to learn from other social movements that have faced the same kind of apathy when it comes to trying to win the public's hearts and minds about something that is important to them. And I think you could look at other movements where that was the case. It was certainly the case with the suffragettes. It was the case with those fighting for civil rights in the U.S. in the 60s, and even today with groups like Black Lives Matter and police brutality, those kinds of issues, we're still, facing a lot of backlash from society. And I think that's always going to be a challenge. But we don't go into this realistically thinking that we're going to, get 100% compliance from, the whole population. So some people will ask me, well, you don't really think the whole world's going to go vegan, right? Well, of course not. But that's not really the question to me. The question is, once we build a community or a movement that has a certain strength, it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a high percentage of the population to have enormous change in society. It just takes a small vocal minority to start with, and then it becomes, somewhat of a domino effect if the movement builds. So that's what we're counting on.
So if people would like to find out more information or find out about your book or your sort of talks, how can they do that?
Sure. Well, I just created and launched a new personal website which has all of that information on past speaking events with some live video recordings that can be viewed there, future events on the calendar, all my biography and press photos, where to find the book, also some excerpts from the book, and all the information on my other presentations. And they're all at robertgrillo.com. So it's a personal website called robertgrillo.com. The book's there. The book, if you want to order the book, it'll link you to the amazon.co.uk site for those of you here. And there's also the freefromharm.org website, which is my organization's website, which is about 500 pages of material to help educate the public about animals and animal exploitation.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out today to talk to us here at BRFM Bridge Radio.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Daniel.